In this lesson, we are going to cover on how to create a flashlight in Unity. So as always, I have prepared for this project. So let's jump into play mode and let's see how this final thing is going to look like. Alright, as you can see, I am in play mode and by default, my flashlight is hidden. If I press the toggle key, which is in my case is F, I can now toggle on my flashlight. And as you can see at the top left corner, there's a battery life, as well as how many batteries we currently have, and the maximum amount of batteries that you can hold. And as you can see, as the battery life fades, the flashlight light fades away. And once the battery life goes out, it slowly increases automatically. And I can press the reload key. Also, as you can see, if I move my mouse up and down, I have this kind of a nice smooth rotation, so to speak. Alright, so this is pretty much the flashlight, and this is what we're going to create in this lesson. If I press on the flashlight, as you can see, this is how the component looks like. In here we have settings like statistics, keys and parameters and stuff like that. In here we have references, so references to our, for example, audio, UI and stuff like that. So all the things that this component will use. We also have the offset, so we can move around this offset to kind of play around where we want our flashlight to be pointing. And if I, for example, change the offset to be something like this, let's say something like this, and if I go to play mode, and as you can see, this is how now it looks like, and everything is working as it should. So let's jump into another project and let's actually start creating this component. Alright, so I am in the new project and this is just a demo scene that you've seen previously. And the only thing that I did is I simply set up this simple scene, as you can see. So it's just a plane and a couple of cubes, as well as the post-processing effects and some lightning. And this is pretty much all I did with the scene. The FPS controller is the standard Unity's FPS controller that I got from the asset store. You can go to the asset store and you can import standard assets package. And with that package, you will get the FPS controller. And the things that I added to this FPS controller is the spotlight, as you can see. And I positioned this flashlight light at this kind of position. Obviously, you can play around and you can position this at whatever point you want. Also, we have this, of course, first-person character, which is the FPS controller camera. And this camera also contains the post-processing layer to kind of render the post-processing effects. And inside of the camera, you have the flashlight object, which is just an object that I also got from the asset store. So you can actually, I'll leave all the links in the description, or if you get all the source files, you can also, of course, get this demo scene, which will also include all the assets that are used inside of this project. And the only thing I did is I simply just had the flashlight, which is an object, and I parented this object into another object, which is simply just an empty game object with 0 rotation on all axes. And that's all I did with this scene. And now what we're going to do is we are going to create a brand new script, which is going to be a flashlight script, and we are going to attach this script onto this flashlight game object. And we are going to create a brand new script, which is going to be a flashlight script. Alright, so now let's double click on this script and let's open it up in code editing software. Alright, so once the script is opened, now we can actually start writing this component. Alright, so what we're going to do first is we are going to include a couple of namespaces. So the first namespace that we are going to use is going to be system.text, because we are going to use a string builder. So let's say system.text. The second namespace that we're going to be using is, of course, TextMesh Pro, because we are going to need to access the TextMesh Pro component. So let's say using TextMesh Pro. And the very final namespace that we're going to be using is going to be Unity Engine .ui. Alright, and this is all of the namespaces that we need to use in this script. So the next thing that we're going to include is going to be required components. because we will need certain components on this object for the script to work properly. So the scripts that we need to attach, or the components that we need to attach to this object that are required by this script, is going to be, of course, the light. So let's say required component type of light. And another component that we need to also include onto this game object is, of course, the audio source. So let's say required component type of audio source. Alright then, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to, of course, start including a couple of variables. So the first variable that you're going to include is, of course, going to be what we can actually include now is we can include the key codes, because we're going to need a key codes to, for example, determine on what key we need to press to toggle the flashlight or to reload the flashlight. So let's include all of the variables, and then we can actually start working on the functionality. So let's say, first of all, this is going to be a serialized field, and this is going to be a key code, and we can call this something like reload key. And by default, let's put it something like keycode dot, well, for example, this key. Then the next thing we need to include is going to be also a key code, and this is going to be for our toggle. So our toggle key, and by default this key can be something like F. Alright, and this is all we need for our keys. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to add a couple of parameters, and those parameters are going to be, well, first of all, batteries. So let's say serialized field integer, and this is going to be a max batteries, and by default let's put something like 4. Then what we need to do is we need to create a brand new integer, and this is going to be the current amount of batteries that we currently have inside of our kind of this personal inventory. Of course, you can create like a actual inventory system where you can actually hold all of the batteries, and the flashlight will access your inventory system, and you can kind of store all of the batteries inside of that inventory system, which will obviously is more logical than just creating this inventory system inside of the script. But just for now, just to kind of create this really simple inventory system, we are going to simply just create it inside of the script. So let's create a brand new integer, and let's say this is going to be a batteries, and by default let's put something like 2 batteries. So then the next thing that we need to add is going to be, well, first of all we need to determine if the battery life needs to reduce automatically. So let's create a brand new boolean which is going to be called auto reduce, and by default let's put something like true. And of course, if it needs to automatically reduce, we need to determine on how fast it needs to reduce. So we need to create a brand new float which is going to be reduce speed, and by default let's put something like for example 1. So then, just like we did here, we need to of course determine if it needs to automatically increase. So we need to say serialized field boolean auto increase, and by default let's put something like false. And of course, if it needs to automatically increase, we need to determine the speed on how fast it needs to increase. So let's say serialized field float, and this is going to be increase speed, and by default let's put something like 0.5, which is the half speed of how fast it actually reduces. Alright, so the next thing that we need to create is going to be the percentage value. So how long we need to wait till we can actually use our flashlight again. So whenever our battery life is going to run out, we are going to have to wait for a certain amount of time, which is till our battery life increases to a certain percentage. So what we are going to do is we are going to create a brand new float, and this is going to be, for example, something like toggle on wait a percentage. Say for example that it needs to wait till 0.05%. We also want to include the range attribute, and this range is going to go between 0 and 1. Alright, so the next thing that we need to include is going to be the public constant, a float, and this float is going to be called a minimum battery life, and the value that we are going to assign to this constant float is going to be 0. And this is not going to change because the minimum is always going to be 0. So this is why we said that this is going to be a constant value, because it's not going to change. But we do want to control the maximum battery life. So let's say this is going to be a serialized field, and this is going to be a float, and let's call this something like max battery life. And by default, let's assign to something like 10. And this is all we need. So then the next thing that we need to include is going to be the follow speed and the offset. So this is going to be used whenever we're going to move with our mouse. Our flashlight and our flashlight light is going to move with a certain kind of offset. So it's going to lerp smoothly instead of kind of instantly going into direction that we are actually facing. So we are going to say this is going to be a serialized field. This is going to be a float, and we can call this something like follow speed. And by default, let's say that this is going to be something like 5. And then the next thing that we want to include is going to be a quaternion. So let's say this is going to be a serialized field, a quaternion, and we can call this something like offset. So let's say that this is going to be by default a quaternion.identity. Alright, so after we implemented that, we can actually now reference some of the references. So first of all, let's actually wrap this into a region. So let's say this is going to be a region, and we can call this something like parameters. Then we can collapse this and we can create a brand new region, which is going to be references. Alright, so the first reference that we need to include is going to be the audio references. We are going to be using audio, so we need to include a couple of references. And this is going to be the audio clip, which is going to be played whenever we're going to toggle on the flashlight. And I called it something like on sound. So of course we need to include another reference, which is going to be called off sound. So whenever we're going to actually toggle off the flashlight, we're going to be calling this, we're actually going to be playing this sound effect. And the very last audio reference that we need is going to be the reload sound. So let's say reload sound. And this is all of the audio references that we actually need. Then the next references that we need to include is of course UI references. So the first reference that we need is going to be the image, and it's going to be called state icon. And state icon is going to determine the state of the flashlight. Obviously, all of these things that I am currently going to do with the UI, you can of course do completely different things. It is simply just my preference and something that I chose to use, but of course you can create a completely different system if you want. So the next thing that I want to include is going to be the slider, and this is going to be the live slider. So the live slider is, if you remember, is at the top left corner was the slider that represents our battery life. Alright, so then the next thing is also going to be the image, and it's going to be called a live slider fill, and we are going to be manipulating the fill's color depending on the current battery life. So we are going to kind of smoothly go between one color and another color. Alright, so then we are going to create a brand new reference, which is going to be the reload text, which is going to be of course the text mesh pro, and we are going to be using this text object to toggle and toggle off this component depending if we currently need to reload our flashlight. So the next reference that we need to include is going to be the count text object, which is of course going to be used as our battery counter. So how many batteries we currently have out of the maximum amount of batteries that we actually can hold. So this is going to be called something like count text, and we can say that this is going to be a null by default. And the very last reference that we need to include is going to be the canvas group, and I called it the holder. And what we're going to use this canvas group for is we are going to use this to hide and show our actual all UI elements depending if we're currently using or not using the flashlight. Alright, and this is all we need for our UI references. So now the next thing that we need to include is going to be the color references. So these colors are going to be used with our live slider. So like I said, depending on the amount of battery life we currently have, the color of our battery life slider's fill is going to be kind of gradually go between one color and another color. So let's say this is going to be a serialized field, a color, and this is going to be called something like full life color. And by default, let's say this is going to be green. All right, so let's include another reference, which is going to be another color. And this color is going to be out life color. And this can be by default something like color.red. All right, and this is all we need with our colors. So then the next thing that we need to include is going to be the object references. And the first reference that we need to include is going to be the camera. So let's say this is going to be a new camera, and we can call this something like camera. All right, so the next reference that we need to include is going to be the game object, which is going to be called the flashlight. And this is of course going to be the flashlight object, which is this flashlight game object. So we are done with our references. The next thing that we need to include is going to be the statistics. So the first thing that we need to include is going to be the serialized field, private, float, and this is going to be called something like a battery life. And of course, this is going to be the current amount of battery life that we currently have. So let's say by default, this is going to be 0. But of course, we're going to update this value automatically. Then let's include another serialized field, which is going to be a private boolean. And this is going to be called something like using flashlight. And by default, it's going to be false, of course. And this is going to be simply just our flashlight state. So if you are currently using or not using the flashlight. All right, so the next thing that we need to include, which is going to be called something like, well, first of all, this is going to be a private boolean, and this is going to be called something like out of battery. So this is all we need to do with our statistics. So now the next thing that we need to include is going to be private variables and some of the properties that we are actually going to use. So let's say this is going to be another region, and as you can see, this is quite a lot of references and variables in general, but this is all we actually need for this component. So let's say this is going to be a private and properties. All right, so the first private variable that we need to include is going to be, well, first of all, private. And this is going to be the enumerator. And this enumerator is going to be used whenever we're going to, for example, reduce or increase our battery life. So let's say this is going to be enumerator update battery life. And by default, let's assign the null value. All right, so the next thing that we need to add is going to be the property, which is going to be the light property. So let's create a brand new light variable, which is going to be a private, and let's call this something like a light. All right, so then let's create a property, which is going to be the light property, and let's call this something like a light, and this is going to be the getter. And whenever we're going to get this property, we're going to check if the light variable, which is the private variable, is equals to null. If it's equals to null, we're going to, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to say light, which is the private variable, is going to be equals to get component light, and if light is still equals to null even when we try to get the component, meaning that the light component is not attached to this game object, we need to say that light is equals to game object dot add component light. So we are simply going to check if the light is equals to null. If it is equals to null, we're going to first of all try to get the component, which is the light component. If it's still equals to null, meaning that we haven't found any component, we are going to add a brand new light component, and we are going to reference it into this private variable. Then what we need to do is we need to say that the light is going to be equals to, actually the light dot type is going to be equals to spot, because of course we want to use the spotlight. And then afterwards, we're simply going to return the private variable. So this is kind of like an insurance to assure that the light component is always going to be attached and used within this class. Alright, so then the next thing that we need to do is we need to create a private float, which is going to be a default intensity. And this is going to be the intensity of the light. So whenever we're going to specify the amount of intensity inside of the light component, it is going to be cached and referenced inside of this variable. So this is kind of like a maximum amount of intensity that this light component can actually have. So we're going to, I just call the default, but you can call it something like max intensity. All right, so then the next thing we are going to do is we're going to say the audio source. And this is going to be the source. And just like we did with the light, we're going to create a property, which is going to be, well, first of all, we're going to create a getter. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check if the private variable is equals to null. If it's equals to null, we're going to try to get the component. So let's say source equals get component. And then let's put in the type, which is going to be the audio source. And if the source is still equals to null, we are going to say that the source is going to be equals to GameObject.addComponent audio source. And what we need to do afterwards is we simply need to say that source is going to be dot play on awake is going to be equals to false. And then afterwards, after we've done this check, we're simply going to return the private source variable. All right, so the next property that we need to include is going to be a float value, which is going to be called get live percentage. So whenever we're going to get the live percentage, we are going to do that by, first of all, saying that battery life divided by max battery life. So for example, if our battery life is equals to 4 and our max battery life is equals to 8, our percentage is going to be 0.5. So this is all we need. All right, so the next property is going to be a float property. And this property is going to be called something like get light intensity. So let's implement a getter. And whenever we're going to try to get this property or the value, we are going to return a default intensity, which is like a max intensity, multiplied by get live percentage. Alright, so what we are doing here is we are simply saying that the default intensity or like a max intensity is going to be multiplied by the current live percentage. And the percentage can be from 0 to 1. And for example, let's say that the default intensity is 12, and we are going to multiply it by the current live percentage, which is, for example, 0.5. Then our light intensity is simply going to be 6, because it's like 12 divided by 2. All right, so after we implemented this, we can implement a brand new property, which is going to be a Boolean. And this is going to be called something like can reload. So this property is simply going to check if we currently are able to reload our flashlight. So we simply say return, or first of all, actually, let's implement the getter, and let's say return. And then let's check if using flashlight is equals to true, and let's put a parenthesis, and let's check if batteries is more than 0 and battery life is less than max battery life. So let's simply check if we are currently using our flashlight and our batteries is more than 0. So our current amount of batteries that we have inside of our personal inventory, and our battery life, which is our current battery life, if it's less than max battery life, we can actually reload our flashlight. So this is kind of like a simple check. So then the very last property that we need to include is going to be also a Boolean, which is going to be a really simple one. It's simply going to check if we are currently more than needed percentage. So let's say more than needed percentage. And this is simply going to return and check if get live percentage is more or equals to toggle on wait percentage. Alright, so this is all we need to do with our variables. So quite a lot of variables, but now we can actually start using these variables, and we can actually now implement all of the methods that will be used inside of this class. So the first method that we need to implement is going to be the start method. So let's say start, and inside of this method we are going to call another method which is going to be called init, and we can now implement this method. And this initialize method is simply going to be used to initialize some of the variables and some other things before starting the game. So let's delete first of all this throw exception, and let's first of all say that the default intensity, or like a max intensity, is going to be equals to light, which is the light property that we implemented, dot intensity. Alright, then we need to say that the battery life is going to be equals to max battery life. And you can of course implement like a save and load, kind of a system that you load in the current battery life instead of actually setting it to the max whenever you start the game. Of course, this is just by default, but you can of course implement a proper system. Alright, so then we need to say that a live slider dot min value is going to be equals to min battery life. Then the live slider dot max value is going to be equals to max battery life, and the live slider dot value, which is the current value, is going to be equals to battery life value. Alright, so then let's say if camera, which is if our camera component or the reference is equals to null, we are going to say that the camera is going to be equals to camera dot main, which is like a main camera. And then let's say that the reload text dot text is going to be equals to, for example, something like reload, and then let's put in a reload key plus parentheses. So for example, something like this. Alright, so the next thing we need to do is we need to update the slider, and we are going to do that by implementing a brand new function. So let's create a brand new private method that we can call something like update slider. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is we want to update the slider's value. So the first thing we want to do is we want to do an if statement, and we want to check if a live slider is referenced. If that's the case, let's say that the live slider's value is going to be equals to battery life. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is we want to update the live slider's fill color. So I want to simply just do the check to check if the fill is referenced. If that's the case, then let's say that the fill's color is going to be equals to color.lerp, and we are going to lerp between out live color and full live color, and as a time we are going to pass in a get light percentage. Alright, and this is all we need to do to update our slider. So now let's go into our initialize method, and let's call this update slider method right here. So now the next method that we need to implement is going to be to update the count text object. So let's say a new method, and let's call this something like update count text. The first thing that we need to do inside of this function is we want to do an if statement, and we want to check if count text is referenced. If it is, then we need to create a brand new string builder, which we can call something like counter or count string. Let's pass in as an argument, for example, something like batteries. Then we can append more text to this string builder. So let's say count string dot append, and then we can append the batteries. Then we can append the slash, and then the last thing that we want to append is going to be the max batteries count. So let's simply say append max batteries, and then the only thing we need to do is simply say count text dot text is going to be equals to count string dot toString, and that is all we need to do to update our counter text object. So let's simply go to our initialize method, and let's call this method somewhere, for example, right here. So let's simply say update count text. Alright, so now we can actually start creating our toggle method. So let's simply go here and let's create a brand new private function that we can call something like update, or for example toggle flashlight. So as an argument, we want to pass in a couple of parameters, and the first one is going to be of course the state, and the next thing is going to be if we want to play a sound. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do inside of this method is we're going to update the using flashlight state. So let's simply say using flashlight is going to be equals to the state that we passed in as an argument. Alright, so the next thing is going to be is we want to update the active state of the flashlight object. So let's simply say flashlight.setActive, and as a state we want to put in of course simply just a state. Then what we're going to do is we're going to modify the past state. So we're going to check if we can actually toggle on our flashlight, because if our flashlight is out of battery, we are not going to be able to do that. So let's simply say the state is going to be equals, and then we can actually modify this by checking if out of battery is equals to true and using the flashlight is equals to true. Then this is going to be false, and afterwards, and if it's not the case, the state is simply going to be using flashlight. So whatever will be passed in as a parameter, this is what the state is going to be. Alright, so then what we can do is we can create a brand new method which we can call something like toggle object, and this toggle object is going to be a method, a private one, which will require us to pass in a state. And this method, or inside of this method, the only thing that we are going to do is we are going to say that the light.enabled is going to be equals to a state. And as a parameter, let's simply pass in the state. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is we want to check if we have referenced the holder, which is the canvas group. If that's the case, then we want to do a switch statement. So let's say switch, and if you press tab twice, you can actually autocomplete this syntax. Then as an argument that we want to switch is going to be using flashlight. So let's create a brand new case, and there can be only two cases, either true or false. So if case is equals to true, we are going to do something, and if case is equals to false, we are going to do something else. So if case is equals to true, then we want to say that the holder.alpha is going to be equals to 1, and we want to say that the holder.block raycast is equals to true. And that's all we need. So if the case is equals to false now, we want to say that the holder.alpha is going to be equals to 0, and holder.block raycast is equals to false. And that's all we need to do. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to check if we need to play a sound, and if that's the case, we are going to implement a brand new function which we can call something like play sound effect. But for now, let's simply just implement this method. So let's simply say generate new method. And inside of this method, the argument that we need to pass in is of course the clip that we want to play. So let's simply say audio clip, and we can call this something like a clip. So now inside of this method, what we're going to do is first of all, we are going to check if the clip that we passed in is equals to null. We are simply going to return from this method. But if this clip is not equals to null, we are going to say that the source.clip is going to be equals to a clip that we passed in, and then we are simply going to say source.play to play the sound. So as an argument in here, we need to pass in, of course, the clip that we want to play, and this will depending on the current using flashlight state. So what we want to do, if we want to put as an argument, simply saying if using flashlight is equals to true, then the sound needs to be on sound effect. And if that's not the case, it's going to be equals to off sound. And that is all we need to do. So now the next thing we want to do is we want to update the battery life process. And what that means is that it means depending on the statistics, we are going to update the battery life process accordingly. So let's create a brand new method for that. So let's create a brand new private method that we can call something like update battery life process. So the first thing we're going to do inside of this method is we're simply going to check if the enumerator variable which we created, which is update battery life enumerator, if it's not equals to null, meaning that something is assigned currently to this coroutine, we're simply going to say stop coroutine, and we're going to pass in this enumerator. Alright, so once we stopped the current process, we can actually start a new one. So then what we need to do is we want to check if we are currently using the flashlight and we are not currently out of battery. If that's the case, we want to do another if statement. Inside of this if statement, we want to check if we need to automatically reduce the battery life. If that's the case, we are going to say that the enumerator variable, which is update battery life, is going to be equals to reduce battery. And afterwards, we're simply going to start this coroutine and we're going to pass in this enumerator variable. Of course, now we haven't actually implemented this reduce battery enumerator, so let's simply generate this method. So this is going to be a really simple method. It's simply going to reduce the battery life if the battery life is more than 0. So let's simply do a while loop. So while the battery life is more than 0, if that's the case, we are going to keep reducing the battery life. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new variable, which is going to be something like a new value. And this is going to be our new battery life's value. So let's simply say that the new value is going to be equals to battery life minus reduce speed multiplied by time dot delta time. Then what we need to do is we want to say that the battery life is going to be equals to math.clamp, and we are going to clamp this new value between 0, or for example minimum battery life, and maximum battery life. We of course want to update the light intensity, and we are going to do that by saying light.intensity is going to be equals to get light intensity. Alright, so the next thing is of course updating some UI elements, and the first element that we want to update is of course the slider. So let's simply say update slider. Alright, so the next thing we want to do, the final thing we want to do inside of this switch statement, is we want to yield for a single frame. So let's simply say yield return null, and this will simply yield for a single frame. Alright, so afterwards, if we are ran out of battery, what we want to do is of course we want to update the battery and to be out of battery, and we also want to update the battery life process. So let's simply first of all create a brand new method that we can call something like update a battery state, and we can implement this new method, and this method is going to take in the argument, which is going to be a boolean, and it will be something like is dead. So if true, then it means that the battery life is the flashlight is out of battery. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to say that out of battery is going to be equals to is dead. Then what we want to do is we want to check if we have referenced the reload text. And if that's the case, we want to say that the reload text dot enabled is going to be equals to is dead. So if we are out of battery, then we are going to display this text object. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is we want to update the state icon. The first thing we want to do is we want to check if the state icon is not equals to null. Then we want to say that the state icon dot color is going to be equals, and then we want to check if is dead, meaning that if we are currently out of battery, then the color is going to be a new color, and the new color is simply going to be a white color with 50% of alpha value. But if our battery is not dead, then what we need to do is we simply want to say that this icon's color is going to be equals to white. So simply just a white solid color. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is we want to toggle the object. But to do that, we want to create a brand new state. So let's create a brand new variable that we can call something like state. And this is going to be equals to if out of battery, then this is going to be equals to false. If it's not out of battery, then the state is going to be equals to using a flashlight. So the very last thing that we want to do is we want to invoke this method that is called toggle object, and we want to pass in as an argument the state. And this is all we need to do with our update battery state method. So let's simply collapse this and let's go back to our reduce battery method. So whenever we are calling this method, let's pass in as an argument true, meaning that we are currently out of battery. And what we want to do afterwards is we want to update the battery life process. And that is all we need to do with our reduce battery method. So what we want to do afterwards is we want to go back to our update battery life process method. And then what we need to do is we simply need to return out of this function. Alright, but if it's not true, what we want to do is we want to check if we need to automatically increase the battery life. If that's the case, then we want to say that the update battery life enumerator is going to be equals to a new method that we will create, something that is called increase battery. And then of course we simply want to start this quarantine. We're simply going to pass in the variable. So what we want to do now is we want to of course implement this increase battery life enumerator. So let's implement a brand new method. Alright, so let's go and let's create this increase battery method. Alright, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to implement a brand new while statement. So while the battery life, the current battery life is less than max battery life, we are going to increase or keep increasing this battery life. So what we're going to do inside of this while statement is we are going to create a brand new variable which we can call something like new value. And this is going to be completely similar as the one that we created in reduce battery method. It's simply going to be battery life plus increase speed multiplied by times dot delta time. Alright, so then what we need to do is we want to say that the battery life is going to be equals to math.clamp, and we are going to clamp this new value between the minimum battery life and the maximum battery life. Alright, so after we updated the battery life, we of course need to update the current light intensity. So let's simply say light.intensity is going to be equals to get light intensity. Alright, so after we created all that, what we need to do then is we need to create a brand new method that we will use to check the current battery life value. And if this value is more than needed percentage, then we are going to switch the battery life process. So let's simply say that we want to call this brand new method, which is going to be called something like battery life check. And let's simply implement this new method. So inside of this function, what we can do is we can simply do an if statement. And what we want to do is we want to check if more than needed percentage. And if we are currently out of battery, what we need to do is we want to update the battery state, and we need to pass in as an argument false, meaning that we currently not out of battery. All right. So afterwards, we simply need to update the battery life process. So let's simply say update battery life process. So after we have this battery life check done, what we need to do afterwards is we want to update the slider, and then the very last thing that we want to do is we want to yield and wait for a single frame. So let's simply say yield return null. And that is all we need to do with this enumerator method. So let's simply collapse this. And we can also collapse this because we're also done with this method. And inside of our toggle flashlight method, the only thing that we need to do is we simply need to call this update battery life process method. That is all we need to do with our toggle flashlight function. So the very last thing that we're going to do is we're going to implement the ability to reload the flashlight, and also we're going to implement this kind of like a smooth movement of the flashlight. So what we need to do first of all is we want to implement a brand new method, which is going to be update, which is going to be a private void, and this is going to be called update. So first of all, what we need to do is we want to say that if input dot get key down, meaning that we're going to check if we pressed a certain key, and the key that we want to check is going to be a toggle key. So if we pressed this toggle key, what we're going to do is we're simply going to call this toggle flashlight method, and as a state, as a new state, we are going to pass in the opposite state of the current state. And of course, we want to play the sound, so let's simply pass in as a true. And that is all we need to do with this if statement. So what we need to do then is we need to check if we pressed a reload key. So let's simply say if input dot get key down a reload key. So if we pressed a reload key and we are currently able to reload our flashlight, this is what we're going to do. We're simply going to call a new method that we're going to implement, which is going to be called something like reload. So let's go and let's generate this brand new method. So the first thing that we need to do inside of this method is we need to update the current battery life. So let's simply say that the battery life is going to be equals to a max amount of battery life. Then of course the light intensity is going to be equals to get light intensity. And what we need to do afterwards is we simply need to say that the batteries, which is the current amount of batteries that we have, is going to be -1. So what we need to do then is, of course, we need to update some of the UI elements. So let's simply say update count text. And of course, we need to update also the slider. So let's simply say update slider. So afterwards, what we need to do is we need to update the current battery state. So let's simply say update battery state. And as a parameter, we are of course going to pass in false because the battery is of course not currently dead. Then what we need to do is we need to update the current battery life process. So let's simply say update battery life process. And the very last thing that we need to do is we simply need to play a sound effect. So let's simply say play sound effect, and as a clip, let's simply pass in the reload sound. And this is all we need to do with our reload method. So let's simply collapse this function. So what we need to do then is we need to implement the smooth flashlight follow. So what we're going to do is we are going to, inside of the update method, we are going to do an if statement, and we are going to check if we are currently using the flashlight. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say that the transform.local rotation is going to be equals to quaternion.slurp, and we are going to do a slurp between a transform.local rotation to camera.transform.local rotation. And we are also going to multiply it by the offset, and as a time we are going to pass in the follow speed multiplied by time dot delta time. And this is all we need to do. Afterwards, what we want to do is, of course, we want to update the battery object rotation. So let's simply say flashlight dot transform dot rotation, and this is, in this case, is not a local rotation, but the global rotation is going to be equals to transform dot rotation. Alright, and this is all we need to do. So the very last thing that we're going to do is we're going to first of all collapse these methods, and we're going to head back to the initialize method. And what we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to update the battery state, and the battery state is of course going to be false. Then what we need to do is we need to say that at the start of the game we want to toggle off the flashlight. So let's simply say toggle flashlight, and the state is going to be false, and also false as play sound, because we don't want to play any sound effect. And this is all we need to do with our initialize method. Alright, and this is all we need to do with our flashlight script. So let's simply save it, and let's head back to Unity. Alright, so as it appears, we made one error, so let's simply double click and let's see what we did incorrectly. Of course, I don't need a percentage symbol. What I need is I need end symbol. So let's simply replace this and we are good to go. So let's simply head back to Unity. Alright, and this is our component. So what we need to do now is we need to reference all of the missing variables. So let's simply go and let's reference first of all the sound audio clips already prepared for this, and I have a couple of clips ready. You can of course get all of the source files and you can get those clips as well. So I simply going to drag and drop the on sound as well as the off sound, and also the flashlight reload sound. So what I need to do then is I need to reference all of the UI elements. Alright, so I already prepared the UI design of this in this project, if you can call that really. It's really simple. It's just a couple of UI elements placed around the canvas. So let's go into 2D mode, and the only thing I did is I created a brand new canvas. As you can see, I called it flashlight canvas. I placed a canvas group component onto this game object. Alright, so then what I did is I created a brand new game object and I made it stretch to fill in the entire canvas. Then what I did is I created the icon, which is the flashlight state icon, as you can see right here. So it is simply just an image which is anchored to the lower left corner. Then what I did is I created this batteries text object, or as we called it in a script, the count text object. And this is simply just a TextMesh Pro text object, which I set to stretch to the top. I also gave a little bit of offset. Alright, so afterwards what I did is I created a brand new slider. I removed the knob of the slider. I only left the fill of the slider as well as the background. And I also removed the sprite images of both of these image elements. Alright, and the last element that I added is simply just a reload text object. Alright, and this is all of the references, all of the UI references that I created. So let's simply go into our component and let's reference all of the UI elements. So the first reference that we need to put in is the state icon, and the state icon is going to be the flashlight icon. So let's simply drag and drop this. The next thing is our slider, which is this one. Then the next thing is the battery life sliders fill, which is inside of the fill area, and this is the one that we need. Then what we need is we need the reload text, which is this one, and also we need the counter text, which is of course the batteries text. And then what we need is we need the holder, which is the canvas group, and the canvas group component is attached onto our flashlight canvas game object. So let's simply drag and drop our flashlight canvas as our holder, and that's all we need to do. Then what we need to do is we need to drag and drop the camera, and the camera component is the first person character. Alright, and the very last reference that we need to put in is the flashlight object. And the flashlight object is this one. Alright, so before we play the game, let's actually configure some of the settings. So let's simply say that we want to automatically increase the battery life, and we want to say that the reduced speed is going to be 0.2 and increased speed is going to be 0.1. So what we can do now is we can simply press play and we can actually start testing our flashlight. So as you can see, I entered the play mode and our flashlight is not visible. So if I'm going to press F, which is the toggle key, we actually have our flashlight enabled and we can actually now use it. Also, as you can see, right here we have the battery life slider. As you can see, the color. Alright, so as you can see, the battery life is running out, so our flashlight intensity is also fading. And once the battery life is going to run out, is going to slowly increase again. So as you can see, we are out of battery. We have this reload key, which is like a reload indicator. And we can actually say that the toggle on weight percentage is going to be something like 0.2, a bit more than 0.05. It is slowly going up, and once it reaches the 0.2 percentage, is going to turn on the flashlight again, and the battery life is reducing. And once it's again out of battery, the battery life is slowly increasing. And if I press, for example, reload, it is automatically increased to the maximum, and we can now use this flashlight just fine. And it appears that it works quite alright. So let's drag and drop this flashlight script into our scripts folder, and let's create a brand new subfolder that we can call something like editor. Alright, so I just imported the flashlight editor script, which I provided. We are obviously not going to cover this script in this video. We are simply going to import it, and if you get the source files, you can also get this editor script. And now if you go back to our flashlight component, this is how it looks like, which is, in my opinion, it looks much more organized and readable. Also, if you enjoy my videos and if you enjoyed this video and you would like to see more videos in the future, please support me on Patreon. It would help me a lot and I could continue making these videos in the future. Alright, and also if you want to get all of the source files, like all of the scripts, all of the UI sprites and stuff like that, all of the demo scenes, you can go into the description of this video, and one of the links is going to be where you can get these source files. But other than that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you very soon in the next video.